What they do is invisible, untraceable, and highly classified.
It's been a clandestine, classified warfare area for many, many years.
Their enemies call their work black magic.
Electronic warfare can be more of an art than a science.
Electronic war aircraft are the first line of attack.
The decision had been made that every strike sortie would have electronic attack associated with it.
But their invisibility may be their undoing.
Electronic warfare has always been a hard sell.
The future of warfare is more than bullets and bombs. Tomorrow's victors must dominate with force and frequency. In 2011, Benghazi, Libya. A fierce civil conflict has been raging for 2 years. Anti-government rebels are dead set on democracy. They demand that dictator Muammar Gaddafi resign from office. He refuses to go. In February, the violence escalates. Gaddafi's troops begin a series of airstrikes against fleeing civilians. It's more than the rest of the world can tolerate.
The international community will impose consequences, and the resolution will be enforced through military action.
The United States military deploys dozens of aircraft to assist in the mission, including a brand new Navy aircraft, the EA-18G Growler. It streaks toward the violence in Tripoli. Most combat aircraft fight in the physical domain. The Growler battles in a realm that's invisible to the naked eye, the electronic spectrum.
This year is the EA-18 Growler. Primary mission is airborne electronic attack.
The EA-18G Growler is a key part of every air attack squadron. Its primary purpose, to shut down the enemy's radar.
The main job of the Growler is to deny or delay the amount of time it takes for an enemy radar to pick up our friendly brethren out there.
One way the Growler does that is by doing something called jamming. Here's how it works. The Growler has a receiver on each wingtip. These receivers search out the radar signals on the enemy's surface-to-air missiles. The information travels to a computer in the Growler's cockpit. Within milliseconds, the computer analyzes the signals and identifies them as safe or a threat. If they're a threat, the Growler activates one of its jamming pods.
Per the configuration, we can have up to 3, one on each wing, and they'll be the same. And then we also have the one here on the center line.
The jamming pods overwhelm the enemy's radar by sending out electronic noise. This allows friendly fighters to sneak unseen past enemy lines.
What we're trying to do is, using jamming, prevent them from actually seeing where we are.
The Growler doesn't just jam the enemy. It can inflict physical damage too.
Our primary mission is jamming. However, a secondary mission we have is using the HARM, as you see here on the wing.
HARM stands for High-Speed Anti-Radiation Missile. It's specifically designed to hone in on the surface-to-air radar's electronic signals.
The HARM zones in on where the enemy radar is, and then looks to explode over it.
The EA-18G Growler is the most advanced electronic attack aircraft on Earth. It can locate, jam, and destroy enemy radar, all in under a minute.
The Growler is an excellent platform here. It's awesome to fly.
Libya's Operation Odyssey Dawn is the perfect proving ground for the Navy's new toy.
In March of 2011, it was decided that the U.S. was going to participate with coalition forces to enforce a no-fly zone over Libya.
Commander Jay Matsko was the executive officer of the Navy's Electronic Attack Squadron in Operation Odyssey Dawn.
In order to protect forces in Libya, protect them from enemy radar systems and surface-to-air missiles, they needed the Growlers.
For the electronic warfare officers, the call comes without warning.
The decision to make that happen was very quick, so we had about 24 hours to get there.
When they get to Libya, the Growlers will face a formidable opponent. The radars on Gaddafi's surface-to-air missiles can locate a target up to 11,000 feet.
We knew that we were going against an adversary that was trained to shoot down airplanes with surface-to-air missiles, and that they had a good number of them.
2 years after reaching operational status, the aircraft is still untested in the battlefield.
There were high expectations for the Growler going on its first deployment. There were a lot of people across the United States watching how they were going to do it in combat, and there was a lot of pressure.
March 18th, 2011, Commander Matsko and his wingman are patrolling the Libyan coastline when their radio starts to buzz.
We got the call that there was an enemy surface-to-air missile site, or SAM, that was potentially active. The location was a threat to our bomb droppers and to our fighters, so we got coordinates for it and we started heading that way.
Moments later, the Growlers arrive to find a crowded sky. Coalition planes are in a holding pattern, reluctant to test the Libyan radar operator's skill.
These operators are pretty well trained. This is not something that anybody could step in and do, and they're constantly training just like we are.
The Libyans have placed the SAM site close to the coalition's target, an ammunition dump.
The enemy knows what their high-value targets are, and they want to prevent us from getting in there and destroying those targets. So they will put SAM sites in and around targets that are important to them.
The strike planes have firepower, but they need the Growler's electronic attack to put the missile out of service.
Me and my wingman were called over to jam it first and then shoot harm at it so that we could destroy it.
The Growler's first challenge is to identify the radar's signal. Exactly how it does that is top secret.
The Growler can do a lot of amazing things, many of which we can't even talk about.
What we can say is that the Growler sees everything on the electronic spectrum. But it relies on the electronic warfare officer to sort through the noise.
Electronic warfare can be more of an art than a science. Many things clutter the airwaves. Could be radio signals, TV signals, ship radars, things you're not even looking for. You definitely have to be meticulous, you have to be focused, and you have to be able to very quickly weed out what is bogus and go for what you're looking for.
Matsko has just one target. The missile has many more choices.
We had coalition and U.S. F-15s, F-18s, Harriers, and they're all flying in a pretty small area.
The Growlers know they don't have much time to make their move.
Depending on the SAM system, the missile flyout could be 10 to 20 seconds. So it's very quick, and everybody has to really be on their guard.
Cluttered airwaves, a crowded sky, and 10,000 feet below, a Libyan missile poised to fire. It's time to see if the Growler can sort through the noise and beat the missile to the kill. Commander Jay Matsko tries desperately to beat a Libyan surface-to-air missile to the punch. The fate of dozens of coalition aircraft is in his hands.
We know that they're relying on us to blank the enemy radars. And if they get a missile shot at them, it could be very quick, and then they'll be killed.
Matsko's wingman locates the radar signal and starts to jam it. Beside him, Matsko prepares his HARM missile and fires.
When you shoot off a HARM, first thing you feel is a shudder in the aircraft, and it flies off incredibly fast, and you see a smoke trail that goes off into the distance. And then the smoke trail stops.
When the smoke trail stops, so does the enemy radar's signal.
One of the ways that we'll know that we hit our target is when the enemy SAM site stops transmitting.
With the threat destroyed, coalition forces move in and strike the ammunition dump.
Once it was apparent that the SAM site was destroyed, these guys could go back to their mission.
Detection, disruption, destruction. It's all in a day's work for an electronic warfare officer.
Flying in the Growler is awesome. Right from the very takeoff, where you push back into your seat from the afterburners, you take off, and you realize you're doing a job, you're doing a mission, and it's very important.
The Growler is the most complicated electronic warfare aircraft ever conceived. But its ultra-modern capabilities come from a technology developed 80 years ago. A technology that was the most important military development of the century. Radar.
Electronic warfare came of age during World War II. Before World War II, radar was just in its infancy.
Roger Connor is a curator in the National Air and Space Museum's Aeronautics Department.
At the beginning of the war, the United States, Great Britain, and Germany had begun to really develop radar.
Radar is seeing with radio waves. It uses the waves to detect objects and to determine their altitude, direction, and speed. For Great Britain, radar technology isn't just a matter of scientific interest. It's a national emergency.
Great Britain pursued radar because they saw it as the only way of stopping German bombers from reaching the cities of England. Radar allowed British fighters to intercept bombers before they approached the British coastline, and that greatly minimized the impact of the German bombing raids.
The Allies begin their own bombing operations and soon discover that the Germans have been developing radar too.
The Germans had their own radar, and so the Allied air commanders realized that they had to have some countermeasures that would make it very difficult for those German radars to determine how many aircraft or their exact position as they came into occupied European airspace.
Allied scientists work around the clock. So do the Germans. The question isn't how to build the radar, but how to outsmart them.
World War II really ushered in the age of the cat and mouse game of electronic warfare. As the Allies would introduce one new countermeasure to German radar, the Germans would come up with a solution to that.
Winston Churchill calls this electronic warfare effort the Wizard War. Whoever comes out on top will determine the fate of the free world. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Allies' latest electronic warfare techniques are about to be put to the test.
The Allies were facing a huge number of German radars, and they had to neutralize them by using electronic countermeasures.
On the night before D-Day, Allied commanders send 10 bombers out with an unusual task: to fly back and forth along the English Channel, dropping something called chaff.
Chaff are thin metal strips that reflect the electromagnetic energy of radar. it created an echo that was similar to an actual aircraft.
The 10 Allied bombers create a ghost stream of hundreds of non-existent aircraft.
The German radar would see essentially a bloom of radar echoes on their scope. So were there just 10 aircraft or were there 100? The German radar really couldn't tell.
The electronic noise blinds German forces, allowing the Allies to sneak into Normandy for the greatest invasion in history.
When the facts about the D-Day operation came out, countries around the world realized that electronic warfare was now going to provide a decisive advantage.
1960, the Pentagon. The Battle of the Beams takes a Cold War turn. The United States can't avoid the Soviet radars, so it builds planes that fly too high for anti-aircraft guns to reach.
With the arrival of the Cold War, the jet airplane was now dominant. Jet airplanes flew high, they flew fast. Knocking them down was going to be a lot more difficult than it had been in World War II.
But the Soviets develop a countermeasure. Missiles that use radar to guide them to the kill, on the land and in the air.
The solution to targeting jet aircraft, moving at high speeds, flying at high altitudes, was the use of radar-directed missiles.
Each nation develops its weapons in secret, but the world soon discovers who has the upper hand.
The Soviet Union scored a major success with the first shoot-down using a surface-to-air missile. This occurred in 1960 in a very famous episode, the downing of Francis Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane.
The Soviet missile is called the SA-2. Its radar can detect an incoming aircraft up to 70 miles away. All of a sudden, the U.S. military's high-flying bombers and their pilots look like sitting ducks.
The downing of Gary Powers' U-2 was a wake-up call to the Pentagon. They realized that any military operation from here on was going to be significantly impacted by this new capability.
1965. By now, the Cold War fight has spread to Vietnam. 17,000 Soviet missile technicians deploy to Hanoi, helping to defend the communists against the American threat. At their disposal, hundreds of the same SA-2 missiles that shot down Gary Powers. American airmen have never faced such a deadly threat.
The SA-2 missile system presented us with a challenge of how to beat something that's radar guided and controlled, travels at extremely high velocity, and is lethal.
Captain T.J. Williams has been an electronic warfare and strike warfare specialist since 1966.
And that began the Battle of the Beams for Vietnam with electronic warfare.
The United States flies the newest, fastest fighters on the planet. But the SA-2 still has them beat.
We couldn't climb as high as the SA-2 could go. We couldn't fly as fast as the SA-2 could fly. And we couldn't put enough G on the airplane to actually beat the SA-2. So to beat it, it wasn't going to be through maneuvers, it wasn't going to be through speed, it was going to be through electronic technique.
The United States has plenty of aircraft that have been modified to jam for themselves. Electric intruders, sky warriors, wild weasels. What it needs now is a dedicated electronic attack plane that can jam for other aircraft. That way, the bombers can focus on just doing their job.
Most of the aircraft had what would be called self-protection jamming. What was missing was a force protection jammer dedicated to protecting multiple aircraft at the same time.
For help, America turns to an old friend, Grumman Aerospace Corporation. Their solution, adapt a new plane that's already on the assembly line, the A6 Intruder.
The A6 was a remarkable new strike aircraft for the Navy. Fairly early in its development process, there were a lot of accommodations made in the design for accommodating a lot of electronic capability.
3 years later, the remodeled A6 Intruder makes its debut as the EA-6B, better known as the Prowler. In service for over 40 years, it's the first plane ever designed specifically for the electronic warfare mission. The Prowler is so advanced, it takes 4 people to operate the new technology.
The EA-6B Prowler has 4 crew members, 1 pilot, and then 3 electronic countermeasure officers. We call them ECMOs. The pilot, obviously, is flying the airplane, so he's the one sitting right there in the front left seat. He's got the controls, and he does everything you would expect of a pilot to do.
The ECMO in the front seat is in charge of navigation. What the 2 in the back do is top secret.
They've got computer screens and a little keyboard right in front of them. So those backseat ECMOs are the ones that are responsible for jamming the things that we need to jam.
Back in Vietnam, Prowler crews know that what they need to jam first is the deadly SA-2.
There was an understanding right from the outset that this was going to be a capability that was absolutely necessary to operations over North Vietnam.
The Navy can hardly wait to bring its new aircraft to the battlefield.
A great deal of excitement by those in the electronic warfare community.
But others in the military are skeptical.
Because electronic warfare is a game of electrons and people don't see things physically blow up, it's very difficult to convey the understanding that this is actually a hugely important part of modern military operations.
And at $20 million each, a dedicated electronic attack plane is a costly gamble.
The Prowler was new, and it was very expensive, and it had to prove itself.
Will the Prowler prove that electronic attack is a force to be reckoned with? Or will the SA-2 continue to have the upper hand? (1972), North Vietnam. 4 years after its maiden flight, the EA-6B Prowler flies into the last few months of the war.
At the time, there was a feel-good sense that the Prowler is here. But there was no way on the spot to measure what the Prowler actually accomplished.
The Prowler accompanies hundreds of Navy bombers, jamming the radar-guided SA-2 missile systems meant to bring them down. The Navy believes that its new electronic warfare aircraft is a success, but the stats to back up their claims are hard to find.
The reason why electronic warfare was hard to understand goes back to you can't visualize it. You're dealing with electromagnetic spectrum. It's in the ether.
Captain Ken Kretsch was an electronic countermeasures officer and lead for the Prowler's Advanced Systems program.
Today it's a lot easier because people are used to cell phones, beepers, wireless, and that sort of stuff. But if you imagine talking to somebody in the 70s or 80s before we had cell phones, they wouldn't understand what you're talking about.
Only the electronic attack community understands that electronic warfare is the wave of the future. And in 1984, the Prowler gets a powerful upgrade: a HARM missile.
The high-speed anti-radiation missile, or HARM, its real purpose was to stop the enemy from using its radars. The whole idea of the HARM missile is basically somebody shooting at me with a missile. I want a missile that is faster and can get to the guy who's shooting at me before his missile gets to me.
The Prowler community thinks it's a perfect fit.
The skills that we had developed, understanding how the enemy uses radars, how it uses electromagnetic spectrum to attack our airplanes and stuff, that gave us the insight that we would know best when to use this anti-radiation missile.
But critics believe the electronic warriors are overstepping their bounds.
Frankly, many of the senior leadership at the time believed that, oh, those guys, you know, they have receivers and jammers. What are they carrying? Things that blow up.
Carrying one of the military's newest missiles is a big step for an unproven plane. The Prowlers know they're under pressure to prove their worth.
In the 20 years after the Vietnam War, the Prowler never had a chance to prove itself. It wasn't until Desert Storm that it had its opportunity for the limelight.
August 1990, the Middle East. Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein orders his army across the border and into tiny Kuwait. 5 months later, a UN coalition takes action. The Allies start with a series of airstrikes. They call it Operation Desert Storm. January 17th, 1991, the middle of the Red Sea, the second night of the war. 2 EA-6B Prowlers and 2 British Tornadoes prepped for takeoff.
We took off, I think it was just a little bit after midnight. We're going to support a Royal Air Force strike in the western part of Iraq.
Getting the strike force in won't be easy. Iraq has some of the most sophisticated radars in the world.
The Iraq air defense system had been developed much more recently than when we had last fought a war. So we knew the equipment they had was very good. So we had expectations for a significant fight.
The Tornadoes have plenty of bombs, but can they get close enough to use them? That depends on how well the Prowlers can jam.
If we do our jamming mission properly, what we want to do is stop the enemy from ever seeing the real airplane that's going in to drop a bomb. Ideally, the first thing they know is a bomb goes off or they hear a jet fly by.
5 hours after takeoff, the electronic attack warriors escort the Tornadoes into enemy skies.
We're now in Iraq, and you could see on your system that there were enemy radars up and operating. They were looking for us.
The 2 British bombers speed toward their target. The Prowlers follow close behind, jamming all the way.
As soon as we think they can see the people we're trying to protect, we have the jammers on at that point.
The Prowlers hope their jammers will prevent the radar from seeing the Tornadoes. But they can't take any chances. They put a harm on the rail and get ready to fire.
The pilot ultimately is the one who says there's no airplane in front of me, you know, the airplane's pointed the right direction, and he actually commits to shoot the missile by pulling the trigger.
It's the first time Kretsch's crew has fired the harm in combat. It makes quite an impression.
We pitch up, fire the missile, and this huge white, fireball comes off. And we're like, man, this is the greatest Roman candle you've ever seen.
With the Iraqi radar no longer a threat, the Tornadoes unload their bombs and head back to base.
All of their airplanes made it back to the base safely. And that's the best you can get.
It can jam and it can shoot missiles. Desert Storm proves that the Prowler is a double threat.
Strike after strike after strike, we accomplished our primary mission, which is to support people, defend them so they can do their mission and get back. It worked great.
Desert Storm was like the debutante ball for the Prowler. The results were unimpeachable and were extremely good.
But in the world of electronic attack, new threats are always on the horizon. And in just a few years, the Prowler must face its most dangerous enemy yet. 1999, Serbia. Yugoslav leader Slobodan Milosevic is years into a murderous ethnic cleansing campaign. In January, his paramilitary troops kill 45 ethnic Albanians, including women and children. After months of watching the tragedy unfold, the international community finally decides to act.
My fellow Americans, if President Milosevic will not make peace, we will limit his ability to make war.
A NATO coalition of 19 countries prepares for a massive air war. The Naval Services brings 27 EA-6B Prowlers to the fight.
The decision had been made that every strike sortie that was going into Kosovo would have electronic attack associated with it, so the Prowlers were in great demand.
Rear Admiral John Cryer was the commander of the Pacific Fleet Electronic Attack Wing during Operation Allied Force.
The Serb air defense system was fairly robust. They had a lot of equipment from the former Soviet Union, and they knew how to use it very well.
Allied forces learned the hard way that the Serbs are dangerous and skilled opponents. Just 3 days into the war, Serb forces shoot down one of the Allies' most treasured assets, an Air Force F-117.
It does underscore how technically adept that the Serbs were at being able to conduct air defense operations against the Allied aircraft. They weren't just throwing missiles in the sky. They were looking very specifically at being able to shoot any of us down.
March 29th, Aviano Air Base, Italy. Cryer and his crew get a call to escort 2 F-15 Strike Eagles on a bombing raid deep in Serb territory.
Our job was to make sure that we were able to stay very close to those F-15Es and provide the jamming support required to keep them from being detected by the early warning acquisition type radars.
But coalition aircraft aren't just concerned with being detected. They're concerned with getting shot down.
The Serbs were actively trying to shoot down every one of the strike aircraft that were coming in. There were a constant series of missiles in the air.
Coalition planes roar over Pristina, heading for their target.
As we came close to the border area there of Kosovo, and the Strike Eagles were about to go into their attack profile, we got the electronic designation for some of the SA-6 radars.
The SA-6, it's the deadliest surface-to-air missile the Prowlers have ever faced.
The SA-6 was even more lethal than the SA-2. It operated in a whole new frequency regime, and it was controlled on the battlefield. So you never knew quite where it was, and you never knew quite where it was coming from.
Cryer's crew scrambles to ready its HARM missile. But it may already be too late.
As we were preparing to fire, we noticed that the SA-6 had fired on us, and we had at least 4 of their SAMs up in the air that were guiding toward the Strike Eagles and us.
Once the SA-6's radar locks on, its missiles can reach the planes in less than a minute. If the Prowler's crew doesn't act fast, the F-15s will be destroyed. Rear Admiral John Cryer and his EA-6B crew faced down 4 surface-to-air missiles in Serbian skies.
We saw those electronic signals from the SA-6 as we were going into the strike area. And it was after that that we saw the surface-to-air missiles actually coming up, the SA-6 missiles coming up at us.
The Prowler's crew has just seconds to take action.
Once they've launched those missiles, they have less than a minute or two before they're, before actual impact. So we immediately fired a HARM, a high-speed anti-radiation missile, against them, and then we continued to jam.
The HARM does its job. With the radar destroyed, the Serb missiles suddenly lose their tracking signal and their effectiveness.
Their missiles missed us. They very close aboard, but did not detonate. But they did not hit us or the Strike Eagles.
During the course of the conflict, the EA-6B Prowlers fly over 2,000 hours in just 78 days. Not a single airman is lost on their watch.
The Prowler's success in Operation Allied Force sealed its legacy as being the most important electronic warfare aircraft in the 40 years after the Vietnam War.
The conflict reveals something else about the Prowler. Its flying days are numbered.
After Operation Allied Force, there was an awareness that the EA-6B was beginning to show its age.
It isn't easy to keep an aging fighter battle-ready. That's where the maintainers come in.
A lot of our aircraft specifically were born or manufactured in the mid-'80s, so it's a 30-year aircraft. It's a lot older than the maintainers that are working on it. So you're going to have special inspections and conditional inspections that require maintenance.
Electronic warfare aircraft must constantly upgrade their hardware and their software too.
The key to our being successful in electronic warfare is attention to detail to make sure the software is working properly and you can really execute the mission the way how you want to.
Despite its age, the Prowler's service is not done after Kosovo. The most extraordinary mission for its advanced electronics is still to come. In 2003, Baghdad. U.S.-led forces have chased Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein from power. But a battle with insurgents rages on. Their weapon of choice, the radio-controlled improvised explosive device, or IED.
Early IEDs were typically pressure plates where you would step on a spring and it would explode or drive a truck over it. Then they started to create the radio-controlled IED.
Captain Brian Hinckley led the Navy's ground efforts to enhance electronic warfare capabilities during Operation Iraqi Freedom.
The radio-controlled IED was detonated or armed through a radio signal. So you could either use a garage door opener or a personal mobile radio or even a cell phone to arm or trigger that device.
The Army spends over $12 billion to counter the IED's electronic attack. Nothing seems to work. But then, the U.S. Army gets some unlikely help from above, the EA-6B Prowler. August 2003. A team of Prowlers heads out on a top-secret mission.
EA-6B is overhead, coordinated with a convoy going out to target an individual that was motivating others to emplace IEDs. The goal was getting some intel from him to be able to find the next step up in the network.
Getting to the target won't be easy. He's deep in the heart of Sadr City, insurgent territory.
We had to assume that there were IEDs everywhere.
Insurgents have had unrestricted access to Sadr City's radio waves. But the Prowlers plan to change that, starting now.
The key is to be able to control the electromagnetic spectrum at a time and a place of our choosing, and to be able to deny it for the enemy's use.
The Prowlers plan to disable the IEDs by jamming them. It's a revolutionary idea.
We had never done it before. So it was all a new game, so you always wonder whether or not you will be effective against a new threat.
As the Prowlers fly overhead, they know that American lives depend on their success.
If you don't have it all right, you will not prevent that radio signal going from the adversary's transmitter to the adversary's IED receiver, and that IED will, in fact, blow up when they want it to.
Prowlers know they can dominate an electronic air war, but can they win the ground war too? An American Special Ops convoy makes its way through the streets of Sodor City. 2 EA-6B Prowlers circle in the skies above, trying to jam the insurgents' radio-controlled IEDs.
Their orbit was in place such that they could protect that convoy as it transversed across its intended path.
All it takes is one lapse in the jamming for the convoy to become a funeral train.
Everything was really critical that it was timed. So you would activate electronic attack from beginning to end along that route.
Minutes after they enter Sodor City, the convoy reaches its target.
The first thing that those guys in that house saw was a flash bang at their door, our forces busting in the door and taking who we needed and what we needed out of that house.
The insurgent leader counted on the IEDs to protect him, but he counted wrong.
The EA-6Bs were able to hold on for one more orbit. The convoy headed back home, cleared the dangerous area in Sodor City. EA-6Bs were able to go back to their base.
The EA-6B Prowler has long controlled the skies. In Operation Iraqi Freedom, it's a key part of the ground war, too.
Crews were never lacking for flight time, always lacking for sleep.
The Prowler has had more upgrades than any other Navy or Marine aircraft. Now, it's time for the electronic attack mission to fly something new.
The EA-6B had been designed in the 60s. It was getting rather old, and there's a finite life to all of our aircraft.
In 2006, Boeing debuts a state-of-the-art electronic warfare aircraft. They call it the EA-18G Growler. It puts the Prowler's DNA into the body of the F-18 Super Hornet, the Navy's go-to airframe for almost 20 years.
The Super Hornet has proven itself in many battlefields, and the Prowler had a lot of great features. So we took the best features from the Prowler and the best features of the Super Hornet and combined them together to get here the Growler.
The F-18 and the Growler have a lot in common. Same airframe, same radar, same weapon systems.
Most of the airframe parts are interchangeable because it's the exact same airframe. So when we're out on a ship, we can take parts from the Super Hornet and the Growler, interchange them, which makes it real easy to maintain these jets.
The Growler improves on the F-18 by adding 1,400 pounds, 2,500 feet of cabling, 66 antennas, and 1.5 million lines of software code.
We look forward to it here in the future for the capabilities that we'll be able to provide to our friendly brethren.
The Navy's newest weapon is poised to dominate the electronic spectrum. But new challenges are close behind. After 34 years of service and more than 11,000 flight hours, the first EA-6B Prowler was retired on June 10, 2011. The others will soon follow.
The Prowler has a wonderfully long and glorious legacy. What the Prowler has done is create the unmistakable need and essential nature of electronic warfare to everything we do.
Electronic warfare aircraft, the Prowler set the standard, and the Growler continues it. New threats, new enemies. The Growler is the ultimate electronic attack platform for the new arms race.
Electronic warfare is becoming much more complex, and aircraft like the Growler are merely going to be a platform by which we can get access to certain types of electronic environments.
Tomorrow's wars will be won and lost on the electronic spectrum, and as new threats rise, the United States places its faith in one aircraft to take them all on, the Growler.